Okay, it has been so long since we have had some new Habs stuff, and I say that sarcastically, that now we have some new Habs stuff, and we're going to go over it here on the YouTube channel. So, today we're talking about the Instigators podcast. This is a Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to noon radio show on MSG Networks that is centered around Buffalo conversation. It's a show based in Buffalo, so they cover Sabres topics, but they do cover a lot of other stuff in the NHL as well. And yesterday, they had a guest by the name of Elliotte Friedman. I don't know if you know this guy, but he's a pretty highly reputable Sportsnet NHL insider. And on the Instigators podcast, Elliotte Friedman went into detail about the situation with the Habs. And when I say the situation, quote-unquote, what we're talking about here is the center situation, because believe me, you could create several situations with this hockey team based off of different aspects of different players and different positional needs, etc. But today we're talking about the centers again, because last time we spoke about the centers, we spoke about Phillip Danault, a guy who was the number one center for the Habs for the past little bit. He had played on the first line with Thomas Tatar and Brendan Gallagher, but in the playoffs, wherein the Canadiens lost to the Philadelphia Flyers after defeating the Pittsburgh Penguins in the qualifying series, Danault was not that first-line center anymore. We've gone over this several times, but Suzuki, Kotkaniemi, two young guys, one's a rookie, one's a second-year player, they were both extraordinary, and as a result, they were the first and second-line centers on the team. Meanwhile, Danault, well, he was shoved over there in the third line. In this conversation is also Max Domi, who was shoved over to the fourth line because of the hierarchy of centers on the team. The video we previously made talked about how Phillip Danault was quote-unquote frustrated, and I say quote-unquote very loosely, because he felt like he had a lot more to give offensively and that his best talents would not be showcased if he was being played strictly on a third-line defensive role. Marc Bergevin responded to this and he said, well, we like to have players who score on all lines, not just on the first two lines. But regardless, that was the video we made previously. Yesterday, we had ourselves Elliotte Friedman, who came on and talked about Suzuki and Kotkaniemi on the Instigators podcast. He said this: with Suzuki and Kotkaniemi in place at center, Montreal will look at the market for both Domi and Danault. I think there's a chance it could be Danault who leaves instead of Domi. I've also heard Danault's name out there. I'm not saying they're going to do it, but I think they're at least testing the market for him, which is normal. Danault is a UFA in a year, and I think he wants, as is his right, a big number. I think Montreal is worried about whether they can handle that. Can you agree on what the player feels his worth is, and what the team feels his worth is? So before we move on, let's just go over that right here. The scoop here is that it may indeed be Phillip Danault who is on his way out instead of Max Domi. Domi has been the guy who many Canadiens fans believe is on his way out because he is an RFA today. His play has declined over the past calendar year. He ended off the season in the playoffs on the fourth line, which is really not somewhere that people thought Domi would be a year ago. The biggest thing, though, is probably that RFA contract. The fact that he needs a new contract and the fact that Darren Ferris is his new agent. Everybody's kind of hoping that if Domi does get re-signed, it's not the same kind of Darren Ferris, Mitch Marner circus that we ended up seeing a year ago. But the uncertainties with Domi's game, plus the developments of Kotkaniemi and Suzuki, have pushed them higher up on the center depth chart. Not to mention Phillip Danault, who is already there by default above Domi as well. But this Friedman idea, where the Habs are doing their own due diligence, where they're testing the market, calling other guys, getting a feel for what Danault would cost, it definitely doesn't surprise me that they're doing that. Because obviously, Elliotte Friedman said it himself, it's normal to gauge the market and at least understand what other teams value your players at, especially if you're in a position where one of them may not be all too comfortable being in a purely third-line defensive role, and the other is an RFA who needs a contract and who has been the subject of trade rumors for the past month. But the main idea at the beginning of this tweet, that it would maybe be Danault instead of Domi that gets traded, that piques my interest a little bit. Furthermore, let's go over onto NHL Watcher's Twitter account. He uploaded a few tweets talking about the situation too. Friedman says that the Canadiens will gauge the market on both Domi and Danault and see what's out there. Danault already has come out and said he is not too crazy about being a third-line center, so there's a chance Danault goes and Domi stays. Friedman says that Bergevin is not afraid. He'll do anything. He's fearless. He's going to do what he feels is right. And I think when it comes to the demeanor and his overall attitude when it comes to trades that Marc Bergevin has possessed, Friedman's absolutely right. The guy is fearless. The guy is not afraid to go out there, make bold moves, make big moves. We saw Weber for Subban. We saw Galchenyuk for Domi. We saw Pacioretty for Suzuki, Tatar, and a draft pick that was traded down to eventually become Matthias Norlinder, as well as Jacob Laguerriere. There have been a lot of scary moves, quote-unquote, that Marc Bergevin has done that have eventually paid off in the long term. The only one that hasn't really so far has been Sergachev for Drouin, but that's a whole nother topic. Continuing on with NHL Watcher's tweets, though, he talks about the same things that Friedman said. Danault is a UFA in a year and he's going to want a big number. If Montreal may be worried that they couldn't handle that, maybe they could trade him. The next thing is that he's come out and said that he doesn't want to be a third-line center, and if you're turning the team over to Suzuki and Kotkaniemi as your number 1 and number 2 centers, you risk having a guy around who isn't very happy about that. And I think the overall morale point of view certainly is the big one here as well, which is why this whole idea of trading Danault instead of Domi and keeping Domi around is somewhat valuable to consider at the very least. Domi is a guy whom we've already talked about it before, but he wants to be a center on this team. People have been bringing up this whole left-wing center situation, whether or not Domi should play one or the other, but it's been apparent that he wants to play center. So if he's a guy who is on a team that's got Danault, Kotkaniemi, and Suzuki, with the latter two being better than he is already, you got no choice but to play in the fourth line, which also contributed to the whole idea of, okay, we should probably trade Domi because there's no room on this team for a position that he wants to play. But if there is no more Danault, if Danault is traded out for some assets or whatever, all of a sudden that third line spot is open. Now, whether or not Domi would be comfortable being a third-line center is beyond me. He was the second-line guy for a while. Suzuki was there on the third line. He also played the right wing a little bit, too, throughout the past calendar year. But depending on what happens with Danault or Domi, somebody is not really going to get what they want here, because either of these two guys, they want to play center. We know Danault wants to be a top 6 guy. You're just not going to be able to do that when Kotkaniemi and Suzuki have been so good. Maybe going into the next season, you do the line rotations the way Claude Julien was doing them. You say, okay, Domi is on the, what we would call the fourth line, quote-unquote, but that's only because he's on the line that happens to go out fourth. It's not like I'm playing him as a fourth-line player, as in the paraphrase sentiments of Claude Julien. If you want to roll this team in a way that has their bottom 6 lines, or maybe even their bottom 9 lines, all distributed and rotated equally, I think that's a little bit more of a better way to balance everything out. It's just, if you do things like that, then all of a sudden you're giving Dale Weiss the same amount of ice time as you're giving to Drouin and Lehkonen. So that's completely off the rails there, and it's kind of the entire other debate of the whole, okay, let's roll our lines equally argument. So, bottom line here is, the Habs have a lot of centers, and they have a lot of guys who probably can play more minutes, and they can play better, higher quality minutes than what they would eventually be given just because of how many other centers the team has. It's kind of weird that this team finally has centers, and it's really weird how it came so quickly. Remember 2 years ago, the Habs were a team that absolutely needed a center, and they drafted Jesperi Kotkaniemi 3rd overall? The next season, Danault really established himself as that number 1. Not really a number 1 caliber center league-wide, but on the Habs, sure, number 1 center. Really good player. Kotkaniemi came in, he was really good. Domi was here, he was really good. But then the next year after that, Suzuki, oh my gosh, this guy from the Pacioretty trade comes over and he does his thing, and he's absolutely phenomenal against Philadelphia. And now we have a controversy. So, talk to me in the comments what you think about this whole idea. Would you rather trade Danault or Domi? Ignoring the RFA, ignoring the UFA things, ignoring all of the contracts. Assume they're on the same level, because at the end of the day, Domi expires today, Danault expires a year from now. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they're similar situations. Would you rather keep Domi, who posted up 70 points a year ago but had a decline this year? Or would you rather keep Danault, who is a very, very underrated defensive center in this league, but who, going into the long term, may be forced to play only in a third-line role behind Suzuki and Kotkaniemi, much to his own personal internal frustration. For me personally, I've been thinking this whole time that Domi is going to get traded just because of the rhetoric we've been hearing from the media, but the possibility of a Danault trade instead is very real, and I think we do need to consider that as well. So tell me in the comments what you think about this whole idea. Hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.